Section 31, Chapter 17 of The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines. The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson by DeWitt C. Peters. Section 31, Chapter 17, Part 3. The word village has many times appeared in our pages, and as it may prove ambiguous to a few of our readers and render them liable to confound its meaning with that of a fixed town, we will here stop and explain its signification when applied to Indians. An Indian village, as understood in border parlance, comprises the lodges, the women, children, old men, and such movable property as Indians may chance to possess. They are usually found in some safe retreat, where the old men, women, and children stay, while the warriors are engaged following the hunt or warpath. The word has become more generalized since it was first given to stationary camps of the savages, and may now include any band of Indians traveling with their families and property. The village is the home of the red man, where those persons and things which he most cherishes he tries to keep intact and sacred from the spoiler's hand. It is also where the Indian allows his love, friendship, and all the better feelings of his nature to exhibit themselves. It is where, in early youth, he has listened to the legends of his tribe, and where he is taught those lessons and forced to endure those trials which are to prepare his heart in seeking out revenge. It is the place where, as he approaches the age of manhood, he takes those steps which are to make for him the reputation of a daring hunter and brave warrior. Here he first learns to shoot his arrows with precision and to handle the lance with dexterity. His boyish feats in horsemanship, which he daily performs in the village, would be witnessed with astonishment by skillful riders. It is here that he runs to welcome his father when he returns either from the chase or the warpath, and, while he listens to the marvelous adventures which his sire has encountered, he secretly wishes himself a man, so that he can emulate his greatness. In fact, the same feelings exist between parent and child with the Indian race, as with those who boast of being more civilized. Youth and the vigor of manhood are the golden days with the savage. To be doomed to old age is considered by him to be a punishment. When he is no longer able to hunt and seek out his enemy, he loses his desire to live. His life is then considered an encumbrance to the camp. The old and infirm, therefore, are often willingly deserted, that they may the more quickly die. The village is always under the surveillance of men who are past the middle age, and who no longer can act out the stirring deeds of the warrior. Their experience renders them capable of giving good advice, and attending to the less active affairs of the nation. They hold the power of restraining the rashness and indiscretion of the younger men. Therefore they are selected to watch over the property of the tribe, while the strong warriors are seeking to provide the dependent portion of the band with food, or to revenge their real or imaginary wrongs. Order and good fellowship is made to prevail in these villages, somewhat similar to the habits found in civilized communities, for the passions and evil propensities of all men are found to be alike, no matter what differences of education or color exist. We find that the Indian tribes have their wise men, whose voices are heard and heeded on all occasions. When these villages are located, or, to use the soldier phrase, when the Indians go into camp, care is taken that each lodge shall be placed where it will not interfere with the common good. The internal economy of these habitations is arranged on a social system which, in many respects, is commendable. When one person is poor, generally speaking, the whole tribe is found to be so. The herds of horses and mules belonging to the tribe are turned loose in one body, as if they were the property of one man. If game exists in plenty, and danger is not apprehended, happiness holds complete sway within these Indian homes. The proverbial caution of the red man rarely allows him to be surprised. Therefore, even in times of peace, he keeps his fleetest horse tied at the door of his lodge, so that he may make haste and collect his property, and be away before his enemy can harm him. These favorite animals are fed by hand. Before trusting his body in sleep, some warrior, in whom the tribe reposed the utmost confidence, must ascend a neighboring eminence, if there chance to be one, and examine the country in search of dangers. Parties are always kept out as spies, and, at the least appearance of suspicious signs, they become easily aroused and vigilant; and if danger really exists, word is immediately sent to their village to be ready to move. This is a homely but literal interpretation of the term Indian village. The reader has seen that the dragoon horses gave out before the fatigues of the march, while the Mexican ponies performed their task so admirably and easily. This was a painful subject to contemplate, and one which no man who loves the noble horse could wish to witness the second time. The dragoon horses, reduced to skeletons from starvation, while retaining all their natural spirit, with tottering limbs, faithfully tried to perform the labor which their riders seemingly asked of them. Long before the arrival of the time when they could no longer support a burden, the soldiers had humanely relieved them from this work, and were assisting them, by all the means in their power, to reach a haven of safety, where food, so essential in restoring their sinking powers of life, existed in abundance. As their little remaining strength was leaving them, they would exhibit the fact by staggering. Finally, breaking down in their hinder legs, they would sink to the ground, but not until they had made the effort to drag themselves along with their fore feet. To relieve them from their agonies and prevent their falling into the hands of the Indians, one by one they were shot. When these horses broke down and began to die off, it was decided to be best to return to Fort Massachusetts, in order to recruit and also to allow the Indians an opportunity to concentrate their forces, when another effective blow could be struck against them. On his return, Colonel Fauntleroy met, at the designated place, Lieutenant Beale, who had managed the affairs entrusted to him very much to his credit. Having once more consolidated his command, Colonel Fauntleroy retired to Fort Massachusetts, which he made for a time his headquarters. Kit Carson, the guide of this expedition, when afterwards speaking of it, says: "During the time our forces were in the field they were exposed to the utmost intense cold weather I ever remember experiencing. We were overtaken by several severe snowstorms, which came near completely using us up. For the success that had so far attended the labors of this body of soldiers, the greatest amount of praise is due to their leader, who set a noble example to his men. During those hours when hardships and trials came thickest upon the command, all eyes were turned to the commander, and, as the result proved, with no lack of confidence. Kit Carson's services were found to be invaluable. His long experience and untiring energy proved to be one of the best anchors of the goodly ship. We should not omit to state, in regard to the severity of the cold, that it was early in the morning, just before the break of day, that the cold was invariably found to be the most intense. During this time, it is the greatest wonder that the Mexicans did not perish, for but few of them had more than one blanket as a covering by night, and the remainder were but very little better provided for. When wood was plenty, and they were allowed to do so, they made large fires and laid down near to them to attempt sleep. After about 1 hour thus spent, they were routed out by being nearly frozen. Getting into close contact with the fires, they would thaw out, and then were ready to make another endeavor to repeat the sleeping operation. In this manner they managed to live through each night, and on the following day they were, apparently, none the worse for wear. A person judging these men as he oftentimes sees them during the summer season, basking in the sunlight on the sunny side of their houses in New Mexico, would not, for an instant, suppose that they could undergo such hardships. And yet they can do so, as the above example sufficiently proves, without allowing one murmur of complaint to escape their lips. With the regulars, who were amply supplied with blankets and buffalo robes, it would appear that they could have obtained sound sleep, but this too proved to be almost an impossibility. The heat of the man's body, during the early and warmer part of the night, served to melt the icy covering of the mother earth just under him. When the cold increased, this was again frozen, rendering the portion of the body nearest to the ground almost benumbed. By frequently reversing the posture a little, some relief from suffering was obtained, but not sufficient to reach a degree which could be called comfortable, or in the least be claimed as desirable. Every member of this expedition can truthfully assert that they have experienced a foretaste of what the first symptoms of freezing to death must be. Finally, the command reached Fort Massachusetts, where, in ease and plenty, the half-starved, half-frozen, half-used-up men soon forgot all their troubles and privations. A few weeks spent at the fort acted like a magic charm in recruiting the men and the remaining animals, when they were once more in a fit condition, and again eager to go on the warpath, anxiously desiring to surpass the splendid deeds of their first tramp. At the permanent camp, which was made near Fort Massachusetts, the Mexican volunteers especially enjoyed themselves hugely. From privations of various kinds, to which they had shown themselves to be well trained, and which consequently affected them but little, they were suddenly placed in a state of comparative comfort and even luxury rarely realized at their own homes. They had not much else to do beyond guarding their animals and attending to such other minor duties as were required by camp duties. Had not their hardy ponies required the rest that was now being given them, these troops would have been kept in more active service; but as this could not be, they were allowed a respite, which they themselves turned into pleasure. Foot races and various athletic games were concocted and played by them, making the time pass merrily by. Their discipline and respect for their officers had reached a degree seldom, if ever, attained by volunteer soldiers, and which in many respects could be imitated with advantage by regular troops. But the time soon arrived for the march to be resumed. At a council held among the chief officers, it was decided that the best and surest course to be followed would be to divide the forces and send them out in quest of the Indians, as if they were separate commands. Thus it might happen that, being caught between the two as they were running from danger, they would rush into it and receive chastisement sufficient to answer all purposes. Acting on this plan, Colonel St. Vrain, with most of the volunteers, was ordered to proceed in one direction, while Colonel Fauntleroy, with the main division, started in another. While on his route, Colonel Fauntleroy traveled close in under the mountains, and kept his men as much concealed as possible, making most of his marches by night. He traveled through the valley of San Luis up to its head. The valley of San Luis is about 100 miles in length. Its greatest width is 50 miles. On either side it is bounded by snow-capped mountains. The scenery of the valley is very prepossessing, being sure to enchant the eye throughout its entire length. In the south the valley is continuous with prairie land, which extends down as far as the settlement of Rio Colorado. It is well watered by mountain streams, and bears the appearance of being an excellent farming district; but the probability is that its climate is too cold for raising crops, and that its true value will be found chiefly to consist in using it for grazing purposes. From time to time the Indians have reported that it contains gold mines, but there are no authentic proofs that this is a fact. At one time the Indians succeeded in making the Mexicans converts to the belief in the existence of these mines, as they showed them specimens of gold which they affirmed to have been taken from them. It was agreed that, for this valuable information, presents, such as blankets, horses, and guns, should be made to those Indians who had openly proclaimed the good news, provided they could conduct the Mexicans to them. A party was formed and started to explore the valley, but as nothing was afterwards heard of their success, and as many of them, to all external appearances, were as poor as ever when they returned, it is presumed that they were duped by the Indians. The bottom land of the Rio Grande, which skirts the southern border of the valley of San Luis, is, judging from the luxuriant hay crops which it produces year by year, quite a good farming section; and no doubt, ere long, the Mexicans will there establish a new settlement, and thus practically demonstrate the use to which this beautiful valley can be put. While passing up the valley of San Luis, Colonel Fauntleroy came to the Punchi Pass. This pass is the main opening through the mountains which bounds the valley of San Luis on the north. The pass itself is less than half a mile wide, but yet it presents some of the grandest scenery human eyes ever beheld. The mountains on either side are not so lofty as their compeers close by, but they are rugged and picturesque. Through the pass runs a bold stream, which at about midway, and at this time was obstructed by a beaver dam that was so scientifically constructed as immediately to attract the attention of the entire party. Near to this dam there is a very large hot spring, which is located close under the base of one of the mountain sides, and which, under the favorable circumstance of a fine day, lends enchantment to the view. The Punchi Pass is but a few miles long and leads into a beautiful little valley, called by the Mexicans after the same name which is given to the pass. On arriving at the Punchi Pass, Colonel Fauntleroy proceeded on through it to the head waters of the Arkansas River, where, fortunately, a fresh trail made by the Indians was found. This trail was followed with such assiduity and prudence that the camp of some spies belonging to the enemy, and which was in their rear, was passed by the Americans one night without their presence being noticed. Early the ensuing morning, before the break of day, the main village of the Indians was discovered. Its occupants were enjoying a war and scalp dance, and their voices, as engaged in the song which usually accompanies such festivities, could be heard for a distance of at least a mile. Unconscious of danger, they were having a merry time. One could imagine, better than can be described, the scene that followed, when 300 loaded rifles poured their contents into this crowd. Suffice it to say, that among those who survived this terrible retribution, the greatest consternation prevailed. But, as a dernier resort, they began to fly, when they were hotly pursued by the soldiers. Before quitting their late camp, some of the savages had managed to get their own rifles, and with them to fire several shots, which did some execution, as 2 soldiers were killed and 2 wounded. Thus it will be seen that the main village of these Apaches and Utahs fell into the hands of the Americans. It proved to be rich in plunder, for it contained all their stock of dried buffalo meat, besides other provisions; also several cartloads of robes, saddles, weapons, ropes, skins, blankets, trinkets, and camp equipage. Most of this property was collected and destroyed by fire, being of little use to the command, whose means of conveyance was limited to their own actual wants. The number of Indians killed in this surprise has been variously estimated, as has been also the number of the red men on the ground when the carnage commenced; but all agree that this was the severest blow these savages had ever received. Among the many other objects of curiosity found by the victors was a medicine lodge, which had, from appearance, but recently been in full blast. It was highly, and to Indian eyes it must have been very artistically, decorated, and contained all the emblems and symbols of witchcraft. If sickness was to be frightened away, or even coaxed to dethrone itself from the afflicted, there was sufficient in this temple of the Indian gods, seemingly, to have answered either purpose. Some potentate of the magnitude of a great chief had, evidently, but a few hours since, been its occupant; for, in his hurry to desert the premises, on hearing the music of the white man's rifle, he had forgotten his beautiful headdress of feathers, and other articles pertaining to his wardrobe, which designated to the captors his high rank. Perhaps, and the surmise may not be far out of the way, this chief was suffering from a gunshot wound inflicted on a recent fight by his pale-faced enemy, and having received one of their most dangerous potions of lead, he was not anxious for another, and therefore made his escape with the activity of a well man. In this expedition a company of artillery, who have before been described, doing duty as infantry, performed a feat that will compare well with anything of the same kind on record. These men, under the command of Lieutenant Bell, who shared all the privations of his soldiers, marched on foot through a mixture of mud and snow, nearly ankle deep, over an uneven country, from the Mosco Pass in the valley of San Luis to the head waters of the Arkansas River, a distance which is computed at 85 miles, in 36 hours, including all their stoppages. This company had been long celebrated as being expert marksmen; therefore their services were much needed when the Indian village was discovered. Although nearly broken down with fatigue, yet as soon as the electrifying news of the enemy being so near at hand reached them, it seemed to inspire them with new vigor. They dashed ahead, and gallantly led the van in this assault which terminated so favorably to the side of the Americans. Colonel Fauntleroy was not satisfied with the victory already obtained, but, after having accomplished all that was possible for him in this quarter, and having scattered the Indians to the four winds, he determined to make forced marches in order to surprise another band of them, who were supposed to be located in a distant mountain haunt well known to his guide. His object in thus hurrying away from the scenes of his late triumph was to reach and surprise the Indians before their friends had time to travel to and apprise them of their defeat. In this maneuver he was also successful. He came upon this second band also before they were aware of their danger. They were routed, and after severe loss were followed far into the mountains. At this camp Blanco, the celebrated Apache chief, was driven to such close quarters that he evidently began to feel that the safety of his whole tribe stood in jeopardy. He made his appearance on a high point of rocks, and asked the white men who occupied the plain beneath for a parley, which was granted him. He said, in the Spanish language, that he and his Indians wished to make peace, that they were tired of fighting. In reply he was informed that the terms he demanded would be listened to on his coming into the soldiers' camp. He was going on to say that he was afraid to trust himself there, when a bullet was sent whizzing by his head, which caused him to decamp in all haste. It was ascertained afterwards that a Mexican, who had great antipathy to this chief, had, unknown to the rest of the party, crept secretly up into the rocks. When he had reached a place where Blanco was within the range of his rifle, he fired, but, as the reader has inferred, he missed an accurate aim. At this latter camp or village, and near the close of this same day, another incident happened which will long be remembered by those who witnessed it. Two Indians, who probably had been absent to some distant section of the country, having no knowledge of the matters which had lately been transpiring, were seen approaching. Gradually they grew near to a cottonwood grove of trees in which the soldiers were resting, thinking, no doubt, that they were there about to meet their friends. A mountaineer by the name of Stewart, who commanded the spy company, and another man, one of the Mexican volunteers, immediately on seeing the Indians, sprang upon the backs of their horses, which chanced to be near by, and started out to attack them. Not until these Indians saw the men advancing were they made aware of their danger, when instantly they turned around their animals and put them on a keen run for the nearest mountain. They were pursued, and the race hotly contested for at least 2 miles. But the Indians succeeded in making their escape, although shots were fired at them, and returned by the Indians. In doing so, one of them was obliged to dismount and leave his horse behind him, which fell into the hands of his pursuers. At the time that the chief Blanco was endeavoring to gain a parley, a stirring scene was being enacted at the soldiers' camp, which was several miles distant. Most of the soldiers had left it, and were then out engaged in the business of scouring the country. In the camp there were all the pack animals, provisions, luggage, etc., of the command. To guard this property there were only about 50 men left, who, anticipating no danger, were employing themselves in cooking and otherwise providing for the wants of their absent friends against their return. The herd of mules was scattered about and grazing under the charge of a few herders. Suddenly a band of about 100 warriors were discovered coming down the little valley where the camp was located. The alarm was given, when each man, seizing his rifle, rushed to place himself in the line of sentinels which were forming around the property. The mules were quickly driven together in a compact body into the center of the camp. Hardly had this movement been performed before the red men came galloping by. Seeing the smallness of the force opposed to them, they made 2 or 3 attempts at an attack on the weakest points of the lines. They were about to succeed, when a shout went up from the Americans, who descried relief in the shape of the foot company which, having been left behind for one night in order to make easy marches and thus partially rest themselves, was now approaching. The Indians saw the near approach of this powerful reinforcement, and, using that discretion which is often the better part of valor, they started off and were soon lost sight of. Had not this reinforcement providentially thus arrived, the Indians would have certainly captured the pack mules belonging to the soldiers, and got away with them. Never was succor hailed with more delight than on this occasion; for, had the red men succeeded in this endeavor, the benefits of this whole campaign would have been greatly frustrated. Colonel Fauntleroy, after thoroughly scouring the adjacent country in the hope of meeting with parties of straggling Indians, but, as the result proved, without success, returned to Fort Massachusetts, where he had the satisfaction of learning that Colonel St. Vrain, in his expedition, had caught other bands of these same Indians, and most severely chastised them. The Fort Massachusetts here referred to has recently been abandoned, and another one has been built, distant about 6 miles from the original site. The name is retained for the new defenses, which are located on the river Trinchera. The present location is picturesque and beautiful in the extreme. In one of his fights, Colonel St. Vrain had overtaken the red men on the prairies, where a running battle ensued, in which the volunteers killed many of the enemy, and made several prisoners. During this skirmish the Indians tried the ruse of setting fire to the prairie grass, and, as the wind was blowing in the direction from which their foes were coming, they hoped thereby to impede their progress, and thus give themselves time to escape. But the volunteers boldly rode through the flames, and successfully continued the chase. The time for which the New Mexican volunteers had enlisted was fast drawing to a close, but, as the hostile Utahs and Apaches were scattered to the four winds, it was thought best not to send out again a regularly appointed force to act against them. Instead, while awaiting the effect of their late telling blows, it was decided to be judicious to keep out, in different directions, small scouting parties, who could better follow the trails of the small parties of fugitive Indians with some prospect of success. It was now the season for the richly laden caravans to arrive on the borders of the territory, and perchance they might fall in with the bands of the hostile savages of sufficient strength to cause them trouble, or it might be the Indians would combine in sufficient strength, being driven by pressing want, to capture some one of these trains, and thus obtain the material for renewing the contest. In view of these apprehensions, it was decided that the regular troops should go out on the plains, where they could be on hand, ready to afford protection in case of need. Major Blake, in command of the dragoons, started out and faithfully performed this mission. After this duty was fully accomplished, he visited the mountains to the northeast of Fort Massachusetts, and then returned to Taos, via the fort and the intervening Mexican towns. While intimating the dangers which may befall trains on their journey across the plains, especially in times of Indian war, it may be well to narrate a fatal adventure which once happened to a small party while traveling this route. Not many miles from Fort Union, and on the plains, there was a clump of hills known as the Wagon Mound, so called from their resemblance to one of those peculiar wagons which are used to transport valuable freight across the country. It being dangerous times, a party of 10 picked men had been sent out to ensure the safe transit of the mail. Everything went well with the little band of travelers, and their prospects were becoming bright for making a safe journey, when suddenly a large band of hostile Apaches and Utahs hove in sight. The mail party, on making this discovery, immediately halted and prepared for a fight. The Indians very soon granted to them this favor. At first the attack was sharply maintained, but at last fortune favored the whites for the time being, and they succeeded in repulsing their foes, who retreated out of sight. The mail party, thus being freed from the unpleasant society of the Indians, at once hitched up their teams and proceeded on their route. It was afterwards learned that the Apaches made the first attack, but they were countenanced by the Utahs, who remained close by. On the return of the unsuccessful war party of the Apaches to the Utahs, the latter at once commenced charging them with cowardice, and boasted that they could have done better. The true state of the case was, that the Utahs were using the Apaches as tools by which to gain plunder, crying "Go, dog," while they themselves were keeping out of harm's way. The anger of the Apaches was fully aroused at these derisive imputations. Under the new impulse, they said to the Utahs, "If you will help, we will return and show you whether we are afraid to meet these palefaces." Another attack having been decided upon, the Indians set out and overtook the mail party once more near to this wagon mound. It was snowing fast at the time, Therefore the white men were comfortably traveling in their vehicles and had their guns protected with suitable coverings to prevent their being injured, for they anticipated no further danger. The curtains of the mail wagons were all fastened down, and there was no lookout kept, for it was considered sufficient to prepare for the furies of the storm. The Indians accordingly approached unperceived, and made such a desperate attack that all the white men were quickly killed. Not one, if the boasts of the Indians can be believed, had time to get out from his seat. Several days elapsed, and no tidings were heard of the expected mail party. Therefore a body of men started out in quest of the missing men, and found them sleeping the last sleep which knows no awakening. The bodies of the dead were decently interred, and since that day the wagon mound is pointed out to the traveler, accompanied with an historical account of this awful tragedy. End of Section 31, Chapter 17, Part 3. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah.